Good afternoon. My name is William Bill Martin. I have the privilege to direct the Religion and Public Policy program at Rice University's Baker Institute. I welcome you to this webinar, The Fight to Make America Christian Again, Christian Nationalism in National and Texas Politics. From its very beginning, more than 20 years ago, our program has had a strong interest in the relationship between religion and politics in the United States, with the stated foundational conviction that a key factor that has largely protected this nation from faith-flavored wars that have torn others apart is the separation of church and state. That same separation has fostered the most diverse and arguably the most dynamic religious culture in the world. If you're interested, you can find a paper of mine on our website titled Secular State, Religious People, the American Model. Because I have written and spoken and organized programs on related topics, particularly about the rise and strength of the movement known as the religious right or the Christian right, I'm often asked to explain the tight bonds between the religious right and the Republican Party. And over the past 5 years, those questions frequently focused on more narrowly on how to account for the strong evangelical support for President Trump, whose personal life and values, professed and manifest, lack perfect congruence with those evangelicals typically espouse and exemplify in their own lives. A comprehensive explanation has numerous aspects, but many of the strands are woven together in something that's come to be called Christian nationalism, a movement, or perhaps more accurately, an ideology or belief that the United States should be an expressly Christian nation governed by biblically based laws. That ideology has become a significant overt force in U.S. politics and religious life. And that's what we're going to explore in this webinar. Now, let me lay out the agenda at the beginning. We're going to start with journalist and researcher Catherine Stewart, who has been reporting on the intersection of religion, politics, policy, and education for over a decade. She has contributed to the New York Times, American Prospect, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the Advocate, Guardian, and Religious Dispatches. She will be drawing on her new book, published by Bloomsbury this year, The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. Following her will be sociologist Andrew Whitehead, Associate Professor of Sociology and Director of the Association of Religion Data Archives at the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture at Indiana University and Purdue University in Indianapolis. He will join Samuel Perry, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Oklahoma, to talk about their research found in their co-authored book, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, published by Oxford University Press in March of this year. Drawing on extensive survey research, they have produced the first comprehensive empirical analysis of Christian nationalism in the United States, which shows, as they will explain, varying degrees of acceptance and rejection of this ideology. And finally, to bring us closer to home, Dr. David Brockman, an adjunct professor at both SMU and TCU, and a non-resident scholar in the Religion and Public Policy program at the Baker Institute, will talk about the role of Christian nationalism in Texas politics, the study of which, also published this year, is available on our website. There's keen interest in this subject. More than 500 people have registered for this webinar. That's more than we could have had in person. And no doubt you will have more questions than we can handle in our allotted time. But I invite you to take advantage of the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and submit the questions you most want to have addressed. I will look at them, try to combine the ones that overlap, and pass them along to our partners, our presenters, who are also our partners in this enterprise. So let's get started with Catherine Stewart and the Power Worshippers.
Thank you so much, Bill. It's absolutely wonderful to be here. I want to thank and acknowledge all of you who are taking time out of your day to join us for this event. I'm grateful to the Religion and Public Policy program and also to Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy for allowing me to participate on this panel with so many writers and scholars whose work I admire: David Brockman, Samuel Perry, and Andrew Whitehead. I'm really honored to join all of you this afternoon. These are challenging times for us all. I think it would be nice to imagine an America where we could all look forward to a moment of national unity in the face of an external threat, like a global pandemic, or in the face of an economic crisis, or even after a national election. But we all know that that is not likely, not in America, not now. It seems like we're more divided right now than we have been at any time in recent memory. The question is why? So I want to talk about one part of the answer. I don't think we can really fully explain our divisions without addressing the rise of Christian nationalism in America. Christian nationalism is not on the fringes of American political life anymore. It is at the center of power. Now, other speakers today will no doubt have a lot to say about what Christian nationalism is. So I'd like to say something about what it is not. The first thing to know is that religious nationalism is not religion. Religious nationalism makes use of religion, but it's not just trying to achieve religious, social, or cultural aims. It is also trying to achieve political power. Now, let me say something else about what the movement is not. It's not just about evangelicals. Now, certainly it includes many evangelicals, but it excludes many evangelicals too. It excludes a significant number of white evangelicals and an overwhelming number of evangelicals of color. It has been shaped in profound ways by certain aspects of Catholicism. And it's strange to say Christian nationalism receives some forms of support from some individuals and groups that do not identify as Christian at all. Here's the third thing the movement is not. It is not a movement that's merely about symbolism. It's not merely about the expression of sincerely held beliefs in the public square. The thing that's at stake in the rise of Christian nationalism is not whether we merely blur the line between church and state or offend the feelings of an outgroup. The thing that is at stake is the most fundamental organization of our political system. It is about whether the United States will continue as a constitutional democracy in a pluralistic society united by an idea, the idea of a democratic republic, or not. There are those political leaders that embrace the pluralism and diversity of our nation and attempt to advance their values in the public sphere by appealing to non- or extra-religious values that a diverse public at large may hold in common. And then there are those that seek to use the power of the state to impose the supposedly correct religious viewpoints on everyone else. And they seek to commandeer the public resources for themselves. I think of the latter as advocates for Christian nationalism, whose proponents make use of theological frameworks in order to justify political power over other people and groups. And political movements are, by their nature, very complex. And this particular movement is more complex than most. It is not organized around any single central institution. It consists rather of a dense ecosystem of nonprofit organizations, for-profit organizations, both religious and non-religious groups. Many of the movement's leading figures have entrenched themselves into the highest levels of our governing institutions in ways that will long outlast the current administration. The leadership cadre and their supporters and allies have spent many hundreds of millions of dollars over decades building advocacy organizations, policy groups, legal activist groups, think tanks, messaging platforms, sophisticated data initiatives, all the features of modern political campaign infrastructure. I lay out much of this ecosystem in my book, The Power Worshippers, and I also focus on some of the most intriguing leading personalities of the movement. But the most important thing to understand about their collective effort is not its variety, but the profound source of its unity. The leaders often insist they're defending absolute truth, but many of us understand what they're actually doing is a kind of partisan activism, one that seeks to concentrate power in the hands of a new leadership, a new elite. In election seasons, the movement acts to transform many of America's conservative churches into what are essentially partisan political cells. So I want to talk a little bit about how the machinery targets churches and targets faith leaders. leaders of the movement have figured out that pastors drive vote. People tend to trust their pastors and religious leaders. And so the key movement leaders and organizations seek to organize pastors into networks in order to get them all on the same page politically. They figure if you can get the pastors, you can get the people. You can go tell the people how to vote. So I want to give you an idea of what this looks like on the ground. I attended a pastors networking event at a church in rural North Carolina with dozens of evangelical pastors from the area. The event was aimed at teaching them how to communicate to their congregations the key issues that supposedly matter in elections and the biblically correct way to vote on them. The event was organized by Watchmen on the Wall. It's a project of the Family Research Council, one of the most powerful policy groups of the Christian right. Watchmen on the Wall has tens of thousands of affiliated pastor members. So from the moment I stepped into the church, I could tell that this was not really a politically neutral affair. Family Research Council President Tony Perkins, who said, spoke at the event, he said, "I believe this last election, 2016, was the result of prayer. We've seen our nation begin to move back to a nation that respects the sanctity of life." So what he's signaling here to these pastors in the room is that the single issue that matters most, that pastors should care about the most, is abortion. They notice if you can get people to vote on a single issue, or maybe one or two issues, 3 issues at most, you can control their vote. Then pastors were instructed to form culture impact teams. The idea is for pastors to create within their churches teams of congregants that will, as they describe it, advance kingdom values in the public arena. So pastors are instructed to figure out which members of their congregation are politically active, well connected to other members, and motivated to get them to vote according to their biblical values. Then they give them very sophisticated tools to do that. A friend of mine who's a pastor at a church affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention tells me that he's receiving an extraordinary volume of emails and tools some of which he's forwarded to me, including sample voter guides sent by the Faith and Freedom Coalition. That's an organization led by Ralph Reed, who's promised to devote $40 million to the current election cycle. This voter guide leaves no question as to how he, my friend, is expected to direct his congregants to vote their so-called biblical values. There are, maybe 6 sample questions. 2 of them are about abortion, and others are worded in such a way that absolutely, shows the pastors which issues they should communicate to their congregants. Very, very straightforward. So there's another tool developed by the Family Research Council. Actually, I have a copy of this here. It's one of the most, Family Research Council, again, is one of the most powerful, influential policy groups for religious right. This is a culture impact team. It's about, team manual, it's about 200 pages of instructions. So they're not just telling people to get out and motivate other congregants to vote. They're not just saying to the pastors, you need to tell your congregants that they need to vote their biblical values on abortion. They give them these incredibly sophisticated tools and resources and messaging materials to help them do that. This Culture Impact Team Manual has about 200 pages of material, and it's really very comprehensive. A fundamental motivation behind these types of tools that they give these pastors is to get around IRS guidelines that say pastors shouldn't be endorsing candidates from the pulpit. But nothing stops congregants from their own church-based activism if it's all about the culture. So several years ago, a pastor I interviewed about this type of initiative called it a God-given loophole. He said it threads a separation of church and state loophole, sort of getting around those IRS guidelines that justify tax exemption. So let me tell you something else about the political messaging of movement leaders. As we know, when they're talking to the congregants or talking to pastors about getting out the vote, among congregants, it's a lot of it is about abortion. In fact, I heard one leader tell a group of Latino pastors, if someone asks you about the minimum wage, you got to say to them, what's more important, a few extra dollars or life? When you put it that way, it's very leading. So I wish I had more to say, more time to say something about the history of the abortion issue here. I don't, because we all have limited time, but I will say something about it, and it's central to understanding Christian nationalism. The story we've come to accept is that the religious right came together around widespread opposition to abortion, and this arose from the grassroots up. But this gets the causality almost exactly backwards. Christian nationalism came first, and it created, I should say, a sort of hyper-conservative counter-revolution, or the rise of a movement called the New Right came first. And it created the abortion issue as we now know it, as an us versus them issue, in order to serve political purposes. And then it used this political construction to change the theology and religion that it pretended to represent. And we think the politics of the culture wars are an effect of the religion, but the reality is that very often the way the religion is represented is to a disturbing degree an effect of the politics. Let's remember that in 1973, when Roe versus Wade was passed, most Republican Protestants supported it, supported some form of abortion law liberalization. It was only a great effort and an effort to unite conservative, sort of hyper-conservative Protestants and conservative Catholics that created the abortion issue as the political issue we see today. When you look at the political messages in detail, and especially the messages that the movement leadership sends to one another and to elites in power, it's not just about abortion. A lot of it is about money. It's about how the Bible favors low taxes or no taxes for the rich, how the Bible favors minimal government or no government, about how the Bible is against, I wouldn't say no government, no government funding of social services and things like that, about how the Bible is against funding the social safety net. Against the social safety net is managed by the church, which is receiving public money directly for the purpose, unless the money is flowing first through houses of worship and then helping people who need services. So I learned a lot about the movement and money when I visited a large agricultural fair in California's San Joaquin Valley. I was there to attend the 20th anniversary celebration of Ralph Drollinger. He's the founder of Capital Ministries, who targets political leaders at the top levels of government. Drollinger's weekly Bible study group in the Capitol has been attended by at least 12 out of 15 former and current members of Trump's cabinet. He also has Bible study groups targeting the Senate and House of Representatives. So he's arguably one of the most politically influential pastors today. The expansiveness of Drollinger's positions on domestic, economic, and foreign policy hits home the fact that this is a political movement, not merely a stance in the so-called culture wars. Drollinger weighs in on a number of social and economic policy questions, including the idea that social welfare programs have no basis in Scripture, and he favors tax policies that benefit the very rich. Now, these teachings reflect an underappreciated fact about the movement, which is its longstanding alliance with a libertarian far-right economic wing of the Republican Party. Many members of the rank and file who end up voting their values on, say, abortion, or they think they're defending the American family, they would in fact want to keep their coverage for pre-existing conditions in healthcare plans. They themselves might benefit from higher minimum wages or worker protections or better funded public schools for their kids. Religious right claims to stand for the American family, but many of the economic policies they endorse are intensifying economic inequality, which is, by the way, today at record levels, destabilizing society and actually making it harder for American families to succeed. These economic positions are echoed among other movement leaders, including David Barton. I write a lot about David Barton in my book. I call him the Where's Waldo of the movement because he sits on the boards of so many of its key initiatives. I know David Brockman will have more to say about Barton here. He's a sort of pseudo-historian, in my view, who sort of manufactures an imagined past of America. He too has argued that the Bible and God oppose progressive income taxes, capital gains taxes, and minimum wage laws. In an essay titled "The Bible, Slavery, and America's Founders," Barton writes, "Different forms of slavery have replaced the more obvious system of past centuries." He adds, "The state has assumed the role of master for many, providing aid and assistance, and with it more and more control to those unable to provide for themselves. The only solution to slavery is the liberty of the gospel. So you see here, Garten is casting forms of government assistance, things like job training and healthcare and aid to women with infant children. He's casting this as a form of so-called slavery. I mean, in my view, this is just wrong on so many levels. But while movement leaders oppose what they call government handouts to the poor, they have no trouble at all with directing the flow of taxpayer money to faith-based organizations, which receive public money already through subsidies, tax deductions, grants, vouchers, and other means. And now, thanks to the current administration's policies, have additional sources of public money. So they don't want to fund their own, like a soup kitchen, a non-sectarian soup kitchen, but they'd be happy to fund a church, which can then run a soup kitchen and also be free in many instances, depending on how the form of aid is delivered, will maintain the right to proselytize along with offering food aid. So now I want to shift a bit to discussing one of the legislative initiatives I write about in my book. Are any of you are aware of the organization, the American Legislative Exchange Council, or the Americans United for Life? It's an anti-abortion organization. These organizations craft pieces of model legislation that allow legislators to easily introduce bills in different states without needing to research and write the bills themselves. They kind of get everyone with the same political vision on the same page. So if a legislator in a state who happens to be pro-life wants to introduce some form of legislation that's going to limit access to abortion rights, she or he will be able to, turn to the work of Americans United for Life and find their model legislation and introduce that bill. Project Blitz works along similar lines. The idea is to overwhelm state legislatures with so many religiously oriented bills that some of them can be expected to get through in the center of the debate, get shifted to the right. The ultimate aim is to get a license for certain faith groups to discriminate against certain other groups and conflate in the minds of the public their religion with the authority of the government. It's a way of signaling to everyone through the law that there is a group that is privileged in society, one with so-called correct beliefs, and other groups that are not deserving of privilege. These initiatives are often cast in the language of religious liberty, but they are expressions of religious privilege. What today's Christian nationalists want is a trump card to overrule the law where it conflicts with their religious beliefs, and thus to withdraw from the social contract that binds the rest of us together as a nation. Ironically, it was the late Justice Antonin Scalia who saw the danger best when he ruled in the 1990 case Employment Division versus Smith that to make an individual's obedience to the law contingent upon the law's coincidence with his religious beliefs amounts to permitting him, by virtue of his beliefs, to be a law unto himself. This, said Scalia, contradicts both constitutional tradition and common sense. Scalia rightly suggested that simply allowing your own religious beliefs to decide which laws you should or should not follow would be courting anarchy. Now that case centered on the question of whether a pair of Native Americans had violated a state ban on the use of peyote, even though their use of the drug was part of a religious ritual. So they said, we want to be able to, we know peyote is illegal, but it's part of our religion, so we want to be able to use it. And Scalia said nonsense. When the demands of Native Americans were switched out for those of religious nationalists, however, Scalia and his fellows rapidly lost sight of the insight, lost track of the insight. So when we look at what's happening in the United States, we often consider it in purely American terms, including religious nationalism. But what we are seeing here is a process that is already playing out in other countries. It is more or less happening in Poland, Hungary, Turkey, and Russia, where political leaders in those countries bind themselves tightly to ultra-conservative religious leaders in order to consolidate more authoritarian forms of political power. This has happened throughout history. It's what happened with Mussolini in Italy, an atheist who happily fathered children out of wedlock and then made Catholicism the state religion. Religious nationalists always run identity campaigns to consolidate more authoritarian forms of political power. There's a we that is under threat. There is a they that we hate. And religion tends to play a vital role in distinguishing the two groups. So it's a form of identity politics in a way. From Franco in Spain to Salazar in Portugal, right-wing strongmen have long allied on alliances with conservative religious movements to sustain their strict regimes. In broad outlines, what we're seeing in America today follows a very familiar pattern with world history. When countries fall apart or become unstable, religious demagogues and forms of religious nationalism often emerge to exploit the situation. They appeal to the anxieties of a militant minority or plurality, and they wield those grievances against democracy, using them as a weapon to establish authoritarian systems of power. So in conclusion, I appreciate that some of the claims I am making may seem pessimistic, but speaking just for myself, I consider myself an optimist. I still believe we have the resources to think deeply and deliberately about who and what we are as a republic. In fact, I take it as this being the reason why you are here too. And this is why we're having this discussion. So thank you again for your participation.
Thank you, Catherine, for that stimulating talk. And some of the questions are coming in about that. But now we'll go next to Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, who will tell us about how this works out within sizable populations, and which they've done, as I mentioned earlier, this is some of the first comprehensive empirical study of this movement. So Andrew and Sam, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you to Bill and to all of our colleagues there at the Baker Institute, Religion and Public Life at Rice. I'm so glad to be here and listening to this too. And so I'll get us started with introducing some of our work, and then I'll turn it over to Sam. And so what we'd like to do is talk a little bit about what we study in our book, Christian Nationalism in the United States, and to provide some data that we've been collecting since then, and show exactly how Christian nationalism really does matter, both now and beyond 2020, as we try to think about where we are as a nation. And so when we look at the United States, and just recently with the Republican National Convention, I'm sure many of you were aware and heard about Vice President Mike Pence in his speech, where he said, and I quote, "Let's run the race marked out for us. Let's fix our eyes on Old Glory and all she represents. Let's fix our eyes on the land of heroes and let their courage inspire. And let's fix our eyes on the author and perfecter of our faith and our freedom. And never forget, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom." That means freedom always wins. And so what was so interesting about this is how he was alluding to Hebrews 12 in the New Testament of the Christian Bible and 2 Corinthians 3, but he was substituting Jesus for the flag and making a really poignant example for us of how the religious right and many Americans really seek to interweave a version of Christianity that they would like to see privileged in the public sphere with society, and ultimately not only the symbols of our society, but our resources and our public policies. So this view we call Christian nationalism, and we look at this in our book. So quickly, trying to define a little bit of what Christian nationalism is, and then also how we measure it in our book. So we define Christian nationalism as a cultural framework. So a cultural framework is a collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, and value systems that idealize and advocate for a fusion of Christianity, or at least a version of Christianity, with American civic life. And so we actually put an asterisk there by Christianity, because when they talk about Christianity, it does bring with it a number of assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, patriarchy, authoritarianism, and even militarism. So in this sense, it can operate like a dog whistle to a certain population, where it means people like us. And the us tend to be white, native-born, culturally Christian. So when we try to measure this in the American population, we generally pull from large samples of American adults, and we ask them a number of questions. And these questions, a couple of examples are, we would ask people to agree, strongly agree, or disagree, or strongly disagree that the federal government should advocate Christian values, or that the federal government should allow the display of religious symbols in public spaces, or that the success of the United States is part of God's plan. And when we look at how people across the US answer these questions, we can assign values to their various answers. And then when we add those up, we can create what really is a scale of Christian nationalism. So it isn't just about, do you believe the United States is a Christian nation, yes or no? But what extent do you think that Christianity should be privileged in the public sphere? And people can vary quite a bit. And so with this slide, we can see that across this whole scale, 0 would be all of those Americans that say they strongly disagree that the federal government should advocate Christian values, or that the success of the United States is part of God's plan. And then at the other end would be everybody strongly agreeing with all 6 questions. But as you can see, there's quite a distribution of Americans all across this scale. And so to ease our discussion today and in our book, we assign basically 4 groups to different parts of this scale. So we have rejectors, that are those Americans who completely repudiate any notion that the United States should have a close relationship with this version of Christianity as its national identity or in public policies with civil society. Then we have resistors. And these are the people that are uncomfortable with the idea of Christianity privilege in the public sphere, but they're not wholly opposed to it. They lean towards opposition, but in some cases, they're kind of undecided about it. Then we have accommodators. And so these are the Americans who are supportive of this idea of Christianity having a role in public policies in American civic life. And they lean towards that acceptance of this Christian nationalism narrative. So their support is undeniable, but it's not comprehensive. The ambassadors, those on the far right end of the scale, these are the Americans who are wholly supportive of this narrative, believe that the U.S. is and should be a Christian nation, and it needs to be privileged in the public sphere. And in order for the United States to flourish, this needs to happen. Now, when we look at these groups and put them together, you can see here the relative size of each group across the U.S. Our ambassadors are actually the smallest group, about 20% of the population. Accommodators are about 1/3. And so together, this is a little over half of the U.S. population who say and believe that Christianity should, to some extent, have a privileged place in the public sphere in American civic life. Resistors are a little over 1/4 of the population, and then our rejectors are about 22% overall. Now, we don't have time to go into the interesting socio-demographic differences, maybe in the question and answer session, but definitely in our book, we draw out how these groups differ and what they look like overall. Now, what we'd like to do is share just a couple of arguments that we make in the book that help explain why Christian nationalism is so important, and we want to understand what's happened in the United States and the polarization that's occurred in our civic life. So as we look towards the election, which is quickly approaching, we can look back to 2016 and also think about where Americans are now in support for Donald Trump. And our argument, one thing that we show over and over, is that white Christian nationalism explains support for Donald Trump. And that's over and above the narrative that we tend to hear, that it's being a white evangelical that explains support of Donald Trump. So let's draw this out just real quick. So when we gathered data soon after the 2016 election in the Baylor Religion Survey, and then a couple years later in the Public Discourse and Ethics Survey, we can see consistently that where you fall on this spectrum of Christian nationalism is a really large and strong explanatory variable for who you supported, or if you support Donald Trump as president, and you voted for him in 2016. So ambassadors, over 75% in one survey, over 80% in another, supported Donald Trump. And you can see that decreases significantly the more that you reject or at least resist Christian nationalism in the United States. Now, what this does too, though, is we can see it matters when we try to understand the U.S. population as a whole. But what about white evangelicals? Well, in one data source, we were able to look at all white born-again Protestants. So if somebody says they had a born-again experience, which is a common marker of being evangelical. And if you were Protestant, we see here that 81% of those in that sample said that they voted for Donald Trump. So this is really close to, I'm sure, what many of you heard in exit polling, that 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump. But look at what happens when we take a step back and draw out our four different groups of Christian nationalism. You can see that among white born-again Protestants, again, the same group, it is the ambassadors and accommodators of Christian nationalism that overwhelmingly supported Donald Trump. If you were a white born-again Protestant who was a resistor, or especially a rejecter of Christian nationalism, the likelihood that you supported Donald Trump decreases significantly. And so to us, this helps, we think, makes it more precise to talk in terms of Christian nationalism, not just white evangelicalism. Because again, the degree to which you embrace this explanation that the U.S. should be and always has been a Christian nation really is doing the heavy lifting here. Now, among these white evangelicals, Christian nationalism is very popular, but not all white evangelicals embrace Christian nationalism. So it's an important point to distinguish overall exactly who was supporting Donald Trump and why. Now, we can also look across religious traditions. And so in this figure, I'll point out just a couple quick things. First of all, the overall story here is that as you're a rejecter to a resistor, to an accommodator, to an ambassador, you're basically more likely to vote for Donald Trump, right? You see one group is different in that way. But notice all the groups, the different types of groups that stick together. We have white born-again Protestants, the white bar, white Catholics are the gray bar, white liberal Protestants are the dark blue bar. And in that ambassador category, it doesn't matter which group you're a part of. If you are an ambassador of Christian nationalism, the likelihood that you voted for Trump is very high. And you actually look more like those three other groups than you do to co-religionists. So white Catholics or white liberal Protestants who are rejectors very rarely voted for Donald Trump, or they didn't support Donald Trump. And so they look a lot different than white Catholics, white liberal Protestants, or even white evangelicals who are ambassadors. So to us, this tells us that Christian nationalism, this cultural framework, cuts across religious traditions and even racial categories, but not to a whole extent. Because as you can see, and Sam will draw this out in just a second, for Black Protestants, it doesn't matter if you're an ambassador or accommodator or a resistor or rejecter. The likelihood that you voted for Donald Trump is very low. And so that tells us something, too, about what Christian nationalism is and how it operates in the United States. And so for that, so one last thing before I turn it over to Sam. When we look towards the 2020 election and we ask people who they plan to vote for, again, Christian nationalism was a strong, significant predictor of who they said they would support in the coming election. And so as we move towards November and after, Christian nationalism will be an important part of understanding what happened and why and who supported which candidate. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sam to take us through our last two arguments.
Okay. So the second argument we wanted to dig into, and we talk about this some in our book, but what we wanted to do is we wanted to introduce some new data. So this isn't data that we showcase in the book, but it's a similar argument. So we argue that not only does white Christian nationalism help us understand why people supported Trump and still support him today, but white Christian nationalism actually helps us understand the polarization that is currently ripping our country apart. And we wanted to take two really prominent examples. I think the three most powerful things that are happening in our country right now would be the election coming up, coronavirus and our response to it, and also this issue of racial injustice. And so we've collected some data recently on how people are responding to coronavirus and the relationship that Christian nationalism has with that, but also on people's attitudes towards racial injustice and how that differs across racial groups, but also Christian nationalism. So the first thing I wanted to show, this is based from data that we collected back in May. So this is May at the height of lockdown restrictions and these government recommendations coming from media sources, scientists, medical experts about what you should do and how you should react to the possible infection from coronavirus. And so this is what I'm showing you here is the percentage of white Americans who said that they never took these precautions in the past 2 weeks. Again, this is about in mid-May, so we're talking at the end of April when everybody is at lockdown, businesses are shut down, and people are really supposed to be exercising these kinds of precautions. we see that as people move up the Christian nationalism scale, from rejectors, resistors, accommodators to ambassadors, we see that they were more likely to say, I never did this. In other words, the ambassadors were the least likely to say, I wore a mask within the past 2 weeks. They were least likely to say, I avoided touching my face. And I could show you some other measures as well, like I used hand sanitizer more than normal, or I washed my hands more than normal. But basically, as Christian nationalism increases, the likelihood that you took precautions to try to prevent infection or the spread of infection actually declines for white Americans in particular. Let me show you the flip side of that. What about the activities that you weren't supposed to engage in, like going out and getting into kind of interaction socially and not social distancing, or getting out of the house? We see pretty much the same thing. So as people move up the Christian nationalism scale, they were more likely to, say, attend church when they weren't supposed to, or more likely to go shopping for non-essential goods, or visiting family and friends in person. That was something that they just weren't going to avoid. So what we saw is, and we published this recently in a study in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, was we saw this overwhelming pattern of, as Christian nationalism increases, the ideology of Christian nationalism increases in the American public, it increased the likelihood that they were going to engage in behaviors that recommendations were kind of cautioning against, and they were less likely to do the kinds of things that people were recommending we were supposed to do to prevent infection, like wear masks, avoid touching your face, wash your hands more, and that kind of thing. Now, why is that happening? There's a couple of reasons. One of them is that just in the scale that we use, the Christian nationalism scale, there's the implicit assumption that God has a special relationship with the United States. And I think within that, there's kind of this assumption that God's going to protect the country. And if the country is going to be derailed in any way, it'll be because of our moral unrighteousness, not because we did foolish things and got one another sick and died from coronavirus. Another example, or another reason why this is happening is, and what we've shown recently in another study with Christian nationalism, is that Christian nationalism tends to be very much associated with distrust towards science and scientists, to be skeptical about the claims of science, and to want to do the opposite thing, or want to teach something else as an alternative to science. With that comes a suspicion of the media, and also a suspicion or a susceptibility to conspiracy theories. And we're actually seeing that, I think, pop around in the media right now with responses to QAnon and those kinds of things. Christian nationalism tends to be susceptible to conspiracy theories, like everybody is lying, and you can't trust anybody, so why follow the recommendations of others? But one thing I wanted to share, this is, we also asked the question, who do you trust during coronavirus? So at the height of coronavirus, we're asking people, who do you trust? And what I've done is I've split up rejectors and ambassadors, so people at the opposite end of the spectrum here. And I've ordered it from left to right, basically whoever ambassadors trusted the most. So look at the far left of that chart. We see the top three groups that ambassadors trusted during coronavirus. We're not medical experts or healthcare experts or scientists or the CDC. They come right in the middle. Who they trust on the far left is Donald Trump, far and away, religious organizations, and then Republicans. But what about rejectors? Those people who are on the opposite extreme, do they trust Democrats more? No. Do they trust some other kind of secular or liberal source? Not really. Who they trust the most seems to be local health department, medical experts, scientists, and the CDC. So what that suggests to me is that Christian nationalism seems to incline white Americans especially towards a kind of a tribalism that I think rallies them towards in a crisis like this. And so what we see is people taking, Christian nationalist Americans especially, taking cues from Donald Trump, religious organizations, and the Republican Party as to how they're supposed to respond during coronavirus. And I think that is what we would argue is that it may have actually contributed to the sustained advance of the disease and even the rapid spread of the disease, is that Christian nationalism may have actually contributed to that kind of behavior, leading to more infections. Something else we wanted to touch upon, this is, again, new data that we've collected. Christian nationalism is powerfully associated with how we think about racial issues. And in many ways, that's actually at the core of Christian nationalism itself. Remember, Andrew said at the very beginning of this talk, when people say Christian in this Christian nationalism formula, when ambassadors, white ambassadors especially, say Christian, it's kind of a dog whistle. What it means is people like us, and often that means white, native-born, culturally conservative Americans. But it doesn't necessarily mean that for African Americans and other people of color. let me show you some examples of how Christian nationalism powerfully relates to our views about race. So this is the percentage of white and black Americans who believe that blacks face a lot of discrimination. And we fielded this back in August, so just a few weeks ago. What we see is that for black Americans, as they increase in Christian nationalism, it basically stays the same, whether they're rejectors or ambassadors. Roughly 75 to 80% of African Americans feel that black Americans face a lot of discrimination. But what about white Americans? We see as Christian nationalism increases for white Americans, we see a precipitous decline in their willingness to acknowledge that black Americans face a lot of discrimination. Why is that? Well, white Americans who are ambassadors are far more likely to feel that whites face discrimination, or white Christians face discrimination. They're unwilling to acknowledge that black Americans face discrimination. This actually plays itself out in something that we're all looking at in the news right now, is our attitudes towards policing and policing reform. To what extent are police abusing and continuing to abuse people of color in a very high-profile kind of way, in a way that we haven't addressed as a nation enough? Well, we see that Christian nationalism very much so shapes our attitudes to police brutality. This is the percent of white and black Americans who agree that, quote, reports of police brutality against black Americans are exaggerated by the media. So the more you agree with this, the more you think they're exaggerated. Look at African Americans. As Christian nationalism increases, almost no change in their affirmation of that fact, or that affirmation of that statement. But for white Americans, look at that climb. For rejectors, we see less than 10%. For ambassadors, white ambassadors, over 85% of white ambassadors feel that reports of police brutality against African Americans are exaggerated. So it's undeniable that Christian nationalism for white Americans is strongly influencing how white Americans are responding to these claims of police brutality and this need for reform. The last argument that we wanted to get into, and this is where we'll conclude, and this is something that Catherine Stewart said, and I want to underscore as well, and I think we see this in our data. Being a Christian nationalist does not necessarily mean being a committed Christian. We don't want to confuse those things. And as a matter of fact, we often find that the two things are at odds. In other words, once we account for Christian nationalism, being a committed person of faith actually seems to incline Americans towards the opposite direction. Let me give you an example just from stuff that I've just talked about. This is the predicted value of precautionary behaviors. Remember those precautionary behaviors like wearing a mask or washing your hands or not touching your face, things that we were all supposed to do during coronavirus lockdown and really should be following today. We see that as in Christian nationalism increases, we see that your likelihood of engaging in precautionary behaviors to limit the spread of COVID actually declines. But what happens for religious commitment? How often you pray, you go to church, you read your sacred text? It actually increases. So once we account for Christian nationalism, being more religious means you're more likely to engage in those kinds of behaviors that we're recommended to do to avoid the spread of COVID. Let me give you another example. This is just a racial attitude. I would confront a friend who told a joke about racial minorities in my presence. We see that as Christian nationalism increases, your likelihood of confronting a friend who told a racist joke declines, right? It doesn't bother you as much. But what happens among the religiously committed? Once we account for Christian nationalism, you're more likely to confront your friend who tells a racist joke because you find that offensive, because it conflicts with what you have internalized about your own religious faith. So again, we are not necessarily talking about being a committed Christian. Being a committed Christian, as I would actually argue that people should be doing that more. It's being a Christian nationalist that seems to incline people to behave irresponsibly towards coronavirus, believe certain things or deny certain realities about the treatment of African Americans that we would hopefully all kind of affirm by now. So just in wrapping up, what are the implications for religion and politics in the United States? We need a new language for talking about Christianity and Trump, one that clarifies that for many, Christian is a political dog whistle. We mean Christian nationalism, not white evangelical, but we mean those who internalize that ideology. Lastly, we need to understand that many white Christian Trump supporters are primarily motivated by fear. Fear of powerlessness, fear of cultural degradation, fear of social chaos. Trump promises to restore an order that they feel like has been thrown out of whack. And I feel like that is what makes him appealing to people who affirm, those ambassadors, those white ambassadors who affirm Christian nationalist ideology. And with that, we will pass it on. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew and Sam. Before David Brockman starts his conversation, I'm getting an echo. Am I causing that? Well, I hope not. In any case, I'm getting several questions that are coming in, and one that is particularly in the last presentation, and that's understandable. People are asking, will I be able to see these charts? Where can I get these? Well, two places. One, of course, is you can buy the book that they've written, which I'm sure they would appreciate. But also for the charts that you have just seen, these will be available. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be available probably tomorrow, but certainly by Wednesday, and the whole thing, and you'll be able to look at it at your leisure. So invite you to come back and do that. Now, David Brockman, tell us about Christian nationalism and Texas politics since 2008.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Before I begin, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Again, here we go. I want to thank the Baker Institute for organizing and sponsoring this webinar, and for the opportunity to serve as a non-resident scholar. And I also wish to thank my colleague, Bill Martin, for serving as moderator and for all the assistance he's given me over the past several years. I'll begin with some quotes. Here's one from Governor Greg Abbott from 2015. The values that Christ teaches were the values and principles on which this nation was founded. From Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, but back when he was a state senator, the values that we are a Judeo-Christian nation, primarily a Christian nation, and there is no such thing as separation of church and state. And then a couple of quotes here from Robert Jeffress, a First Baptist Dallas pastor, Fox News contributor, and Trump advisor from 2016, the book that he wrote in 2016. The fact that our Constitution demands that everyone have the freedom to embrace any religious belief or no religious beliefs does not mean that the government cannot demonstrate a preference for Christianity over other religions. And he also says the framers of the Constitution did not hesitate to declare that America was a Christian nation. The First Amendment does not even require that the government treat all faiths equally. Well, statements like these should sound pretty familiar after what we've heard from Catherine, Andrew, and Sam. What I'd like to point out is that these are all quotes from Texans, prominent Texans, and that points to the fact that the Lone Star State is a hotbed of Christian nationalism, the home of some of its major proponents. But how has Christian nationalism actually shaped the political landscape here in Texas? That's the question that I've set out to answer in my ongoing research project. This spring, the Baker Institute published my report on the first phase of that research under what I admit is not a very sexy title, Christian Americanism and Texas Politics since 2008. Christian Americanism, by the way, is synonymous with Christian nationalism. I personally prefer Christian Americanism, but I'll use Christian nationalism here in this presentation to avoid confusion. The report does not focus on critiquing Christian nationalism itself. I'm skeptical of Christian nationalists' historical claims, but I'll leave that to the academic historians. I also take issue with Christian nationalists' belief that Christianity, typically in a conservative evangelical form, should dictate law and public policy. However, that's an argument for another time and place. The point of this report, this Baker Institute report, is not critical, but descriptive. And since the report runs to nearly 90 pages, I'm unable to cover it in detail here. Instead, I'll talk about what led me to undertake this study, what I found, and what's next. I've been studying and writing about Christian nationalism for several years. Initially, I focused on how it has influenced Texas public education, and specifically the controversial overhaul of the Texas public school social studies curriculum standards in 2010. And some of that research can be found in my very first Baker Institute report, Religious Imbalance in the Texas Social Studies Curriculum, another sexy title, published in October 2016, and it's still available on the Institute's website if you want to take a look at it. I've also written for several publications, including Texas Observer and Religion Dispatches, about Christian nationalist influence on Texas politics more broadly. In the course of this work, I found that though there is a growing literature on the ideology nationally, and my fellow panelists' works are outstanding examples, comparatively little systematic scholarship has focused on Christian nationalism in Texas politics. My ongoing research project seeks to fill that gap. The first step was to map the territory of Christian nationalism in Texas, to identify the main proponents, both in and out of government, and the means they use to promote the ideology. And the Baker Institute generously funded this initial step of my project. This first descriptive study serves as a springboard for more analytical investigation, which is the next phase of my research. At present, for instance, I'm analyzing the response of prominent Texas Christian nationalists to the COVID-19 pandemic, and more on that later. All right, mapping the territory breaks into three parts. Who are the major proponents of Christian nationalism in Texas? What means do they use to promote it? And what further research is necessary? So, major proponents. Just as the rise of the religious right in the 1980s and 1990s cannot be understood without reference to movement leaders like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, Christian nationalism cannot be understood as a force in Texas politics apart from the religious and political figures who promote it, frame the movement's message and goals, and inspire and motivate their followers. The first part of the report offers a who's who of Christian nationalism in Texas since 2008. I profile 6 prominent and influential lawmakers and 12 non-governmental Christian nationalists, including political activists, ministers, and major donors. The profiles indicate the degree to which each figure appears to embrace the ideology and the type of influence each exerts. Among the lawmakers profiled are some familiar names in Texas politics: Senator Ted Cruz, Congressman Louis Gohmert, former Governor Rick Perry, current Governor Greg Abbott, and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. The non-governmental activists profiled are amateur historian David Barton, author and media personality Glenn Beck, self-described political operative David Lane, doctor and activist Steve Hotze, economist Gary North, oil and gas developer Tim Dunn, billionaires Dan and Ferris Wilks, and pastors Rafael Cruz, Robert Jeffress, Dave Welch, and John Hagee. And that brings us then to the second question. What means do these Christian nationalist lawmakers and activists use to promote the ideology? And I found a wide range, some of which I had only been dimly aware of when I set out on this project. Not only books and other publications and mass media outlets, but also nonprofit organizations, PACs and super PACs, social media, churches, other religio-political gatherings, and of course, legislation. The last of these, legislation, offers an interesting surprise that demands further investigation, as I'll discuss momentarily. Like many public figures these days, several of our state's Christian nationalists regularly take to social media to spread their message, and they've gained quite an audience. For instance, as of February of this year, David Barton's Facebook site had nearly 180,000 follows. First Baptist Dallas pastor Robert Jeffress, also active on social media, had over 217,000 Facebook followers as of February 2020. And in 2019, last year, Jeffress posted an image of the Statue of Liberty emblazoned with the quote, "Our country was founded as a Christian nation." The post had received over 2,800 likes by the following day. Another means, nonprofits and super PACs that promote Christian nationalist ideas and activities. Here are 2 examples, both involving conservative Christian billionaires Dan and Ferris Wilks, residents of Cisco, Texas, known as the Koch brothers of the Christian right. First, Dan Wilkes' nonprofit Heavenly Fathers Foundation has helped to fund David Lane's Pastors and Pews efforts, which offer free lodging and meals for pastors and their spouses, enabling them to hear messages from Christian nationalists such as Rick Perry, Greg Abbott, Ted Cruz, Raphael Cruz, and David Barton. Second, Ferris Wilkes and members of his family reportedly gave $15 million to the Keep the Promise super PAC, headed by David Barton, that backed Senator Cruz's ultimately unsuccessful presidential bid. Now, findings. Perhaps the most significant finding of the report offers something of a puzzle. It involves legislation, or more precisely, the lack thereof. Given the core Christian nationalist claim that the founders intended that Christianity would shape U.S. law and public policy, and that it should do so today, one might reasonably expect to see sympathetic legislators introduce bills giving preferential treatment to Christianity or the Judeo-Christian heritage. However, few measures explicitly favoring Christianity have been filed in the Texas legislature over the past decade. Instead, sympathetic legislators have filed myriad bills that, though not explicitly pro-Christian, would arguably advance the Christian nationalist agenda. These include measures requiring biblical instruction in public schools and allowing school prayer or carving out religious liberty exemptions. These bills are couched, however, in terms of protecting religion generally rather than privileging Christianity explicitly. For instance, shielding persons who act according to sincerely held religious beliefs. So why the apparent disconnect between, on the one hand, Christian nationalist public comments asserting the nation's essentially Christian character and calling for promotion of Christian values, and on the other hand, the rarity of legislation expressly privileging Christian belief and practice? Answering this question could get at the function of Christian nationalism in Texas politics. For instance, does it function primarily as a legislative agenda, or does its main function lie elsewhere? The report identifies three explanatory hypotheses that merit further testing. They are not mutually exclusive. The first hypothesis: in order to shield pro-Christian legislation from court challenges, Christian nationalist lawmakers avoid using explicitly Christian language in legislation or using Christian beliefs to justify the legislation they support. Instead, the task of connecting legislation with conservative Christian beliefs is left to Christian nationalist activists outside government. Hypothesis 2. Christian nationalists are playing the long game, taking an incremental approach to breaking down church-state separation and privileging conservative Christianity. For example, legislation promoting school prayer or legally shielding those who discriminate on religious grounds, even without explicitly pro-Christian language or elements, sets legal precedents that could pave the way for more explicitly Christian preferential legislation in future. Catherine mentioned Project Blitz earlier, and the Project Blitz legislative playbook for 2018-2019, in which David Barton was involved, suggests that something of the sort may be at work. Discussing a model bill that would require "In God We Trust" to be prominently displayed in government buildings, the playbook's authors note that, quote, even if it does not become law, it can still provide the basis to shore up later support for other governmental entities to support religious displays, end quote. Now, hypothesis 3 is a bit more wonky than the others, but may be the most persuasive. This hypothesis suggests that Christian nationalism functions in Texas politics primarily as a symbolic boundary, and only secondarily as a political program or a legislative agenda. Symbolic boundaries create in-groups and out-groups to draw lines between those who are welcome and those who are not welcome. They separate us from them. According to this hypothesis, then, Christian nationalist rhetoric defines who is a real American and who is not, whose voices count in political discourse, and whose values deserve to be enacted in law and public policy. And by the way, Andrew and Sam make similar observations in Taking America Back for God. When politicians use Christian nationalist rhetoric, they are identifying themselves as one of us, people like us, as Sam put it earlier, defenders of the nation's alleged Christian essence, rather than one of them, separationists, secularists, non-Christians, etc. And they also affirm and reinforce conservative Christians' own sense of identity and moral superiority. If this hypothesis 3, bears out, then the apparent lack of legislative follow-through does not mean that Christian nationalism is ineffective or politically insignificant. Rather, Christian nationalist rhetoric is, in a sense, an end in itself, alongside the goal of implementing legislation and policy that furthers the Christian nationalist agenda. So, what's next? As I mentioned earlier, I've been tracking how the Christian nationalists profiled in Christian Americanism and Texas politics have responded to the COVID-19 pandemic this year. Among other things, Governor Abbott, the highest-ranking Christian nationalist in state government, has faced an open revolt from his fellow Christian nationalists, such as Steve Hotze and State Senator Bob Hall, over lockdowns and the statewide mask mandate. Yet the intensity of that revolt, and it's been pretty intense with the word tyranny being thrown around, monarchy and so on, tends to conceal the fact that the governor actually has far more in common with his opponents than it may appear on the surface. And I hope that this study will be available from the Baker Institute later this year. And if we're able to return to some semblance of normal post-COVID, Christian nationalism is likely to remain a potent force in Texas politics for some time to come, and thus should give my fellow panelists and me plenty to study. So thank you.
Thank you, David. Well, we have a large number of questions here. Several people have asked, and this would go to Andrew and Sam. They want to know, how did you get your data? How can we trust your samples, so forth. So tell us about, I know you discussed this in the book pretty adequately, but go ahead and tell us about the sources of your data for your research.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'll go first. So in the book and with some of the data that we share with you today, the Baylor Religion Survey is a national random sample of American adults. And then we also in the book use the General Social Survey, which is a nationally representative sample of American adults as well. And we draw on those two primarily. And then I'll let Sam answer with the other data we bring from.
Right. So we also use the Chapman University Survey of American Fears, Wave 2019. And then my colleague and co-author, a guy named Joshua Grubbs, who's a psychologist at Bowling Green State. We've been collecting panel data called the Public Discourse and Ethics Survey for the past, I guess, about a year now. And we've collected 4 waves of that data and are going to collect more waves in the future. But I want to underscore that's a tremendously important question. How can you trust the data that we're using? I think what gives us, all of them are nationally representative samples, either through the sampling method or through the weights that are applied or like applied to the data. But I would just underscore that the findings that we present with regard to, say, like predicting Trump vote or Americans' behaviors or Americans' attitudes towards racial issues or sexuality or gender or those kinds of things, they're the same in every survey. I mean, I can't underscore enough like how no matter what survey we use, in any survey that we've been able to test these kinds of hypotheses, the results stay the same, and no matter what we control for. So even if we control for, say, religious identity or political identity or Republican Party or age or region, all of these things seem to point to just the profound strength of Christian nationalism as an ideology that seems to influence Americans' behaviors and attitudes.
Thank you. Here we have questions, several questions here that are related from John Scott and James King twice. Good, thoughtful questions. These are all aimed toward Catherine. I said, be interesting for the first speaker to contrast the peaceful organizing and protesting of the pro-life movement over the decades against the rioting, looting, and anarchy of the left wing of the Democrat Party this year. Another question said, continuing actually, it seems odd that people of faith organizing to oppose the murder of millions upon millions of unborn babies would be castigated with a freighted term like nationalism. How would these people oppose such an abomination against humanity and their God, if not through peaceful organizing? And another question, Dr. Stewart, how are the tactics and strategy toward church congregations and pastors of the Christian nationalists different from those rather successfully pursued by the LGBTQ rights movement? Are the hidden goals of these two movements around political power any different?
So, that's a lot of questions. Thanks so much for the questions. Take them one at a time. First one, I think we can look at the Women's March. I mean, I'm not saying this was I think that it's a little bit of a false comparison to compare all of these marches, but I mean, the Women's March was an entirely peaceful march. So that was definitely a peaceful expression of concern about the consequences of the 2016 election. I think it was record numbers of folks turned out. And I don't think there was any violence whatsoever associated with that march. So I'm not entirely sure what you're getting at, comparing apples and oranges. What is the next question? I'm so sorry. Oh, you talk about LGBT organizing. Look, all political members of all political parties organize, obviously, to turn out the vote and deliver messaging to people who would be favorable to the message. But a big difference is that in the sort of in the Christian nationalist sphere, the messaging, a lot of the sort of the infrastructure sits at the top of a long pyramid that operates largely in the religious sphere, which means it's exempt from taxes and also exempt from public scrutiny. I mean, it's interesting. I think that folks on the religious right like to say we're just like everyone else when they want to say put their programs in public schools and just want to say put in God we trust signage everywhere. They say, well, this is just a perspective like everyone else. We're just trying to take advantage of the forum, and we just want to have our speech, have our free speech like everyone else, and be treated on the same basis. But they're also not treated. Are they treated the same way not by our tax code? Religions enjoy substantial benefits and exemptions that other non-religious nonprofits do not enjoy. They're not treated the same by our legal code. Religions are allowed to discriminate against people of other faiths, against women in ways that other non-religious nonprofits are allowed to do. So it seems like it's kind of trying to have things both ways, isn't it? You sort of want to have your cake and eat it too. You want your tax exemptions and exemptions from public scrutiny and a license to discriminate, of course, when you want it, and yet the right sort of to do political organizing along with other sort of organizations that are doing that supposedly on the same basis. The fact is, religions occupy a very special place in our society. They have these privileges, I think rightly, but precisely for that reason, they should be kept separate from the political sphere. That's why we have the separation of church and state. We have, I think, the sort of atmosphere of religious diversity and vibrance in our country precisely because we've had a separation of church and state.
Bill, can I follow up on Catherine's statement?
Sure. Jump in. Any of you jump in.
I think our data might have something to say about just kind of the pro-life issue. I think from my perspective and what we're seeing in the data, I think there's a kind of a pro-life stance and even a pro-life activism that I think really takes a holistic, valuing all of life kind of approach, and is the kind of life-affirming, people of faith and it's not about, say, oppression, or it's not about constricting people's freedoms, or at least it's not intended to be that way. And then I think we've also seen that there's kind of a pro-life or what I would call an anti-abortion stance that's really just about traditionalism and social order and things kind of violating a way that we feel like the world ought to work. And I would say that the Christian nationalism that we're observing in the data seems to be more of that latter variety rather than a life-affirming kind of a pro-life stance. The reason I say that is because we actually have been collecting a lot of data on, say, people's attitudes towards gun control, the military, war, and even how we lift restrictions due to COVID. And we actually find Christian nationalists, even though they do tend to be anti-abortion, they also tend to be very, very much pro-gun, strong military, pro-war. And they also tend to be very much of the persuasion that, hey, we ought to lift social distancing restrictions as soon as possible. And if people get sick, they get sick. And it's worth the health risk to older Americans so that we can preserve the economy. And those kinds of things. And so that would suggest to me that oftentimes the anti-abortion stance of the kinds of Christian nationalist Americans that we're observing in the data are not necessarily the holistic pro-life stance. It's more of one inclined to kind of say, hey, this is the social order and we ought to preserve that. And they don't really have a problem with violence or death or anything.
Anyone else there? Well, thank you. You also were able to answer several questions of people came in and talking about COVID and the relationship to that and the divide between whether masks are good things or not and so forth. And one about the problems that pastors have in talking with their congregations about that and having to deal with funerals and things like that. Several questions there addressed. Here's one that says, I wonder if panelists could talk a little more about the influence of Christian nationalism on American foreign policy. I'm thinking here not only of Secretary of State Pompeo, but also the U.S. relationship with Israel. Who'd like to take that?
Well, I could.
Well, I will. Go ahead.
Stab and then turn it over. So in our book, we look at this a little bit. I think what's interesting is as we look at how those, whether it's Robert Jeffress, the pastor of First Baptist Dallas, or Secretary Pompeo, or others, when they would talk about the nation state of Israel or moving the American embassy to Jerusalem, and they were saying that there's a wonderful move. The U.S. is on Israel's side. We find that, in that sense, many Christian nationalists are pro-Israel, where the nation state. But when we ask them about Jewish Americans, we actually find that they tend to fear Jewish Americans and think that they don't share the same values and morals, and maybe even fear that Jewish Americans want to do them physical harm. And so there's kind of a distinction between the people that are Jewish and the nation state of Israel. And so I think that really influences how they view foreign policy, where they want to make sure that, again, for the U.S. to be on God's side, they believe it has to be on Israel's side. But when it comes to the people, they view it very differently. So that's something that we found in our data, but I'm interested to hear what others have to say.
Yes. We had a question. I think I sent that to you all earlier today. One person had written in and said she was troubled by this, but talking specifically about holidays and where President Trump has said now we can say Merry Christmas again and that sort of thing, and that saying Happy Holidays or Season's greeting was considered not the right thing to say to some people. But she said this shows up. What do you say about whose holidays? We don't celebrate Diwali. We don't have stores closed, at least in most neighborhoods, for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Do you have any further comment on that, since you are talking about that? It's okay if you don't.
I will say, just David Brockman actually quoted from Robert Jeffress's book Twilight's Last Gleaming at the beginning of his talk, and I remember from that book explicitly Robert Jeffress says that the government and secular society, or the government in our society, is under no obligation to give, according to his logic, under no obligation to give equal time to any religion besides Christianity. If a pastor prays at a football game before the beginning, they're under no obligation to let a Satanist or like a Muslim minister pray or do anything like that. And so he very much is of the persuasion that preference can be shown to Christianity. And I think he would absolutely say, as a matter of fact, I think Robert Jeffress actually did that a few years ago. He actually posted on his website something about Scrooge or Grinch or whatever, but he basically was listing businesses that said Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas, and so that people could not go to those businesses or shame them or that kind of thing. And so I think Christian nationalism would very much inclined to want to maintain a monopoly on all kind of sacred traditions and expressions in the United States.
Yeah. And then to the foreign policy question, I can say a little bit about that. And you've already mentioned about the strong appreciation for Israel, the importance of Israel. And actually, I have an article that's on our website somewhere, I'm not exactly sure where, called Waiting for the End, that I wrote for The Atlantic in 1982. And it deals with things like Waiting for the End, well, it's called Waiting for the End, but the Left Behind series, before that, all the kinds of things that various writers, there's a whole, a substantial segment of evangelical and fundamentalist Christianity that subscribes to a group, a belief called dispensationalist premillennialism. I won't go into all the details on that, but one of the key things that is expected of them, and they're reading the various signs. I think it's quite interesting because people say they take the Bible, they take the book of Revelation literally, which is far from the case. But going through scripture and taking various things and looking for signs of the end times, and believing that we are in those end times, and that one of the major signs that Jesus cannot return until Israel is in control of all of Judea and Samaria, which would include, of course, the West Bank. And when that particular segment of Christianity, which is a large segment of American evangelicals, fundamentalists, when they see that Israel, that the capital is now seen in Jerusalem, not in Tel Aviv, which is much more secular, and that moving on to lifting the restrictions against where, well, it's interesting that these deals that have been made, which are interesting deals, they are with the United Arab Emirates, they're with other areas, but they're not with the Palestinians. Many Christians who hold to these views are seeing this as this is another sign, the end is near. So it figures in, the theology there figures importantly in the support of Israel on the part of these very many conservative Christians.
I would just affirm. Sorry to talk so much, but I would just affirm. What we talk about in our book, we actually show that one of the leading predictors that you subscribe to Christian nationalism as an ideology is that you believe in a literal rapture. This event where this is a premillennial dispensationalist view that Christians are going to be called up to heaven to meet with Jesus before the tribulation, and so believing a rapture is definitely heavily connected with contemporary expressions of Christian nationalism, like Jeffress we've been talking about.
Absolutely. This is another data question, and they want to ask if Andrew and Sam, if you have data, these data for previous elections of Christian nationalists voting for Romney or McCain or George W. Bush.
Yeah,
I don't recall the, but go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, this isn't anything that was in the book or that we published in previous outlets, but the General Social Survey has a question where it asks Americans and respondents if they believe that to be a true American, it's very important that you must be Christian. And so this is a measure that we use to identify kind of this idea of Christian nationalism. You have to be a Christian to be American. And when we look at past waves, we find that those that say you must be a Christian, very important to be a Christian to be American, is strongly associated with voting for past Republican candidates. But what's interesting is that it's even a stronger association through the years. And so there is something going on where believing that to be an American, you must be Christian was really pushing people more and more to support the Republican candidates over various years.
All right, we're getting close to the end of our time. Elaine Howard Eklund, who is one of my colleagues she directs the Religion and Public Life program it's separate from the Baker Institute, but we are dear friends, and in fact, Professor Eklund is she's a Baker Institute scholar in our program, and a great friend both of the program and of mine. And she asks, what can we do as policymakers and those who are interested in policy to more thoughtfully address the political, religion-motivated response to COVID? And we've said something about that already, but is there anything else that you would like to add? It's okay if you don't.
Oh,
I think it
did somebody want to go? I feel like I've talked a lot.
That's all right. You have a lot to say, and it's good. That's why we invited you.
So I think based on the data that we saw related to coronavirus, I think that the fact that people who are more affirming of Christian nationalism tend to be very much trusting of their religious organizations, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think it does suggest that religious organizations still have a tremendous amount of power among anybody who is a person of faith, and so I just think it's the most tragic thing in the world that these social media posts where you have pastors who are videotaping themselves, basically flagrantly violating recommendations, and saying that you've got people like John MacArthur, I think was a recent example, and I think John MacArthur has kind of jumped on the Christian nationalist bandwagon over the last couple of months. I didn't think he had, but he basically is kind of making a badge of honor out of not wearing masks and not social distancing, and I think that's tremendously unfortunate and counterproductive and potentially life-threatening. And so I think to the extent that we can speak in terms to those religious leaders in a way that does not call them stupid or call them or mock what they believe or try to override their religious beliefs, but try to frame these recommendations in the terms of like loving your neighbor. Like it really is the most loving thing you can do to try to prevent the spread of infection and protect the vulnerable. Those are supposed to be things that Christians value. And so I would hope that kind of, rather than just do this because the government said so or because the media said so or scientists say so, rather tapping into that underlying ethic of loving your neighbor, protecting the vulnerable, serving those who are less fortunate by being responsible, behaving responsibly. I would hope that would be my first goal.
Thank you. I want to deal with a question that is a very good one, and this is we or the people here or other people. Is anybody saying that that religion shouldn't have any role in policy? And of course, we're not. And believers in Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, traditional religion, all have something much to contribute to moral wisdom and admirable social ideals and behavior. And as they try to shape public policy, they can't be expected to leave their religious convictions behind when they enter the political arena. But their contribution should come as a result of competition in the free marketplace of ideas, not on the basis of a claim to divine warrant. Beliefs that are dependent solely upon revelation, thought to be divine and peculiar to specific religious communities, are simply not a viable basis for either the domestic or foreign policy of a multicultural democracy and a pluralistic world. Americans can't require other nations to adopt the principle of church separation, but I see no problem in our being willing to acknowledge its great success and demonstrable advantages over other models. So you may want to thank God for it, but you don't have to. Now, with that, it's time to wind up our discussion, and I want to thank Catherine and Andrew and Sam and David for their important contributions to our understanding of this influential aspect of contemporary American policy and religion. I expect you'll want to learn more, and good places to start, of course, are with their writings, the ones we've talked about and others you can learn about on our website and theirs. I also want to thank our peerless webinar wizard, Macy Stewart, for her expertise, her kindness, and her always courteous patience in helping our webinars run smoothly. But thank all of you also out there in webinar land for tuning in today, including in the spirit of religious broadcasting, the shut-ins and the sick and afflicted. I invite you to stay abreast of the many Baker Institute publications, webinars, videos, podcasts, and at some point, live events by regularly checking the home website and also the websites of the individual programs, including, of course, the Religion and Public Policy program, where you can sign up for our mailing list. I'm pleased to tell you also that our website is about to receive a thorough overhaul, which you will see that it needs. So stay current, stay safe, wear a mask, drive safely. Good afternoon.